We're on Daf Ayin Dalid Amid Beis, approximately 15 lines down from the top of the Amud. And the words that open up the line that we want to start with today are Tanya Ida. And the Gemara is trying to derive the Isser Achila and Shasiya on Yom Kippurim. We had one approach from the words Ta'anu es nafsho seichem, as we discussed yesterday, and that phrase repeats itself in one form or another no less than 5 times. And in each of those 5 times, we expanded our definition of the Isser Achila, the scope of the Isser Achila. We started with Pigul and Nosar, correct? Just give me 1 second to give you the list. Pigul and Nosar. Then we went to Tevel. From Tevel, we went to Nevela. From Nevela to Chulin. From Chulin to Truma. From Truma to Kodshin. And the constant repetition of Inui expands the scope of the Isra Achila. Now, the Gemara is offering an alternative source from which we derive the Isra Achila and Shasiya on Yom Kippur. Tanya Ida. The Torah in Parshas Achremos. B'chodesh hashvi be'asar lachodesh ta'anu et nafshel seichel. Yochel, I might think, Yeshev b'chama, if it's a hot day, he should go out into the heat and afflict himself. Or Batsina, if it's a cold day, he should go out in the freezing cold. Be it's tired, and he should afflict himself with suffering. Talmud Lomer v'chol malacha lo sasu malachu davar shechayav alev b'makom acher. Ma malacha is af inui nefesh shechayav alev b'makom acher. Ve'ezeh zeh zeh pigul v'zeh nos. Okay. Second. Sorry, I read the, at the end of every sheet, I put a little line and so, but I was looking at the wrong line. Oh. The im nafshecha lomar. Okay, so let's sort of mention where this is. You see that Daf Ayin Daled Amid Beis is narrow and then it gets wide on the bottom. Before it gets wide, if you count up 3 lines, you'll see a line that starts with V Nisan and ends with the Im Nafshecha Lomar. Those 3 words from this price of Im Nafshecha Lomar indicate or introduce an alternative derivation of Inui on Yom Kippurim from Achil and Shasiya, that we have to abstain from eating and drinking on Yom Kippur. We're not going to derive it as we did in the previous brisa from the Hekesh to Iser Malacha, but rather from a pasuk in Parshas Emor. Arehu Omer, when the Torah speaks about the punishment for violating the Iser Inui, it says, Va'avadati es hanefesh hahi mikerav hamo. What is the Torah emphasizing here with the phrase Havadati es hanefesh? what is Avedas HaNefesh? What does it mean? What does it indicate? Le'inui shehu Avedas HaNefesh. We're talking about subjugating you to a certain kind of affliction from which you could possibly die if you wouldn't limit it. Ve'eze ze, what is inui sheyesh ba avedas hanefesh? Ze achila u'shesiyah. What keeps a person alive? And in its absence, aveda, he would lose his life. Achila and shesiyah. They're makayim es hanefesh. If he doesn't eat or drink for a certain period of time, he will perish. And that's called inui shehu avedas hanefesh. If a person is not makayim inui, then he's involved in ibud nefesh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take away his nefesh because he wasn't involved in ibud nefesh. The Torah is requiring ibud nefesh, and the punishment for the absence of ibud nefesh, if he eats and he drinks, is ibud nefesh. So the Gemara says the following. Apparently, if this brisa adds a second interpretation, a second derivation for the Isra Achil and Shesiyah and Inui, and introduces this second interpretation with the words Im Nafshecha Lomar. Nafshecha Lomar means, and if you insist on finding an alternative, there must have been something in this brisa, some svara, that inhibited the brisa in terms of the first Yalfus. My v'im nafshecha lomar. What would have been the counter argument from the dissenting opinion that voted against the first drasha in favor of the second? What was bothering them about the first drasha? B'chi tema, the Gemara says that in the middle of this brisa, you have to add an entire paragraph before the Im Nafshecha Lomar. And that unwritten paragraph is being written, it's being filled in now by the Gemara. And that's going to be the counter argument or the objection to the first Yalfus. What would be that objection? Be'arayos kamishtai kra. The pasuk of V'nitzem es nafshosechem, as the Gemara is going to prove, is a reference to arayos. What the Gemara means by arayos here is not what it usually means, being a forbidden relationship, but arayos means tashmish hamita. And the Torah is telling us V'nitzem es nafshosechem, to afflict yourself by abstaining from sexual relations. Shareu Omer, and I'll prove it to you. Vavadati es hanefesh hahi mikerev hamah. I'm going to prove to you that the Torah, in the context of Inui, is not limiting the Isur to Tashmish Hamita, but rather expands beyond Tashmish Hamita. How do I prove that to you? Because the pasuk says, "Vavadati es hanefesh le'inui sheyesh bo avedas nefesh ve'ezeh ze achilun shesiyah." Don't tell me that the word inui means inui from tashmish hamita, and that's the Isur of Yom Kippurim. No, that argument will not hold water because of the avadati es hanefesh, which means that we're talking about an inui sheyesh bo avedas hanefesh, and that could only be achila and shesiyah. So once again, just to summarize, there was a Havamina that V'nisem es nafsho seichem is limited to Tashvish Hamita. The maskana is that based on the pasuk Avadati es hanefesh, I derive that I have to expand the Isser of Inui to include Achil and Shasiya, Davar Sheish Bo Ibud Nefesh. But now the Gemara is going to give us an alternative way of determining that V'nisem prohibits Achil and Shasiya. That's the Beir Rabbi Yishmael Tana. Nevar Khan on Yom Kippur it says Inui, but Nevar Lahalon Inui. In the parsha of Yeridas Haman, it says Vayancha, Vayarivecha, Vayachilcha es Haman, and that's a pasuk in Achrimos. So the pasuk opens up with the word Vayanecha. Well, I should really pronounce it Vayancha. With an ayin, say it in a guttural way. And then the end of the pasuk says, after Vayancha vayarivecha, vayachilcha es Haman, is malahalam, just like in the pasuk regarding Achilas Haman, when it says Vayancha, it means inui of re'avon. Now, this is very paradoxical because the Torah, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought down miraculously the man in order to avoid re'avon, in order to solve the problem of starvation. But nevertheless, there's a certain element of starvation even when you're eating the man, which is going to be the next sugya in the Gemara. But in any event, we now have a definition of inui based on the pasuk Vayachilcha es Haman, and that means that inui is re'avon. Afkan inui re'avon. Just like the Torah is saying that I denied you food, but I gave you man, but the man still leaves you with re'avon, with hunger pains, we'll call it. So too, the same exact word of inui appears in Yom Kippur to tell you that you're prescribed, you're prohibited from achila and shasiya. You have to get into a state of re'avon, of hunger. Now, when Rabbi Yishmael in this brisa is analyzing the word inui, what is the meaning of the pasuk v'nisem or ta'anu es nafshel seichem? And Rabbi Yishmael, in order to answer that question, stretches his arm out to the inui of the man. The Gemara asks, wait a second. I'm going to prove to you that the same word inui appears in a different context, referring to a different isur, a different ma'aseh avera. And that should shed a light on what v'nisem es nafshel seichem. B'nelef mi imtana es b'nosai. This is Lavan accusing Yaakov Avinu of Tana Espinosa. You've afflicted my daughters, right? Because Yaakov is married to the daughters of Lavan, and Lavan is now accusing Yaakov of afflicting pain into his daughters, Lavan's daughters, Yaakov's wives. And what this means is minias tashmish hamita. Now again, this is a sugya that we're going to get to later on, in which we're going to prove that inui means the absence of tashmish hamita. But if we plug it in to the words of Lavan and ta'anes b'nosai, we're talking about inui of tashmish hamita. So now we're really in a bind because we have a whole new interpretation of the word inui, the concept of inui. The Be'er Yishmael said the concept of Inui should be derived from man as achila, but now we can derive the meaning of the concept of Inui from Lavan, and it refers to Tashmish Hamita. So therefore, you really are baffled here. You want to assume that the definition of Inui, i.e. Achil and Shasia in Tanit Bei Rabbi Shmuel, is derived from the Parsha of Man. I want to offer another alternative possibility. I want to be very argumentative, that maybe the word Inui in Tanuas Nafshosech Yom Kippurim should be equated with the Inui in the accusation of Lavan against Yaakov, that you are denying Tashmish Hamita. That's Inui. And the Gemara answers, Donin Inui de Rabin, the Inui de Rabin, the ain't Donin Inui de Rabin, the Inui de Yochid. When Yaakov Avinu when Yaakov is accused by his father-in-law of Inui, that's Inui de Yochid. That's only an Inui to the wives of Yaakov. We want to derive and shed a light on the concept of Inui de Rabin in the case of Yom Kippurim. The Torah says, it's not addressing Yaakov Beryl and so forth, so it's addressing all of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, done in Inui de Rabin, Inui de Rabin. If Yom Kippur is Inui de Rabin, then let's compare it to Achilas Haman, which was also an Inui de Rabin. Ain't done in Inui de Rabin, Inui de Yochid. We will not derive an Gzeir Shava as far as Yom Kippur is concerned, which is Inui de Rabin. The Torah is addressing all of Klal Yisrael, the requirement of Yom Kippur. And we're not going to derive that from the Inui of a Yochid in the case of the wives of Yaakov, but rather we're going to derive it from the Inui of Achilas Haman, because that addresses itself to the entire nation of Israel. When you walk away from this sugya, you think about the possibilities that the Gemara is raising in terms of the Nitzem Esnafchoseh. It's kind of like shocking. We're so familiar with Yom Kippur as a fast day, and yet the Gemara had a Havamina that the Torah is only enjoining you from eating pigul and nosar, or from teva, or from the Valens. Now the Gemara has a Havamina that B'Nisam Es Nashosechem is only as far as Tashmish Hamita is concerned. V'neilif mi'inu de Mitzrayim t'siv v'yares on Yenim v'amrinon leprishus derech eretz. Here we have a case of the Inui that's referring to Inui de Rabin, in contrast to the case of Nishos Yaakov, and we're talking about the people of Israel being afflicted in Mitzrayim by Yares on Yenu, and Hashem becomes aware of our Inui. What was that Inui in the Pasuk by Yares on Yenu? On Yenu, our Inui. It was referring to Precious Derech Eretz, which means Menias Tashmish. And now we're talking about the Rabbin. We're talking about Inui de Rabbin of Klal Yisrael. Ella says the Gemara, we have to backtrack and reformulate this logic. Done in Inui b'dei shamayim mi Inui bidei shamayim ve'ein donin inui bidei shamayim inui bidei adam is inui that's generated by a human being. He causes an affliction to others. And then there's inui that is required according to shamayim. So, for example, as we apply these concepts here, in regard to achilas man, and with regard to Yom Kippurim, in both of those contexts, the inui is bidei shamayim. God created inui in the case of achilas haman. Again, we haven't discussed exactly how. That's the very next sugya. And God requires inui in the case of Yom Kippurim. It makes sense to compare the inui b'dei shamayim of achilas man with the inui b'dei shamayim of fasting on Yom Kippur. However, when you talk about the inui of Yom Kippurim and compare it to the inui b'dei adam of either Yaakov Avinu is being accused of such an inui, or alternatively, no, yeah, I got confused. Or alternatively, the inui of preachers Derech Eretz and Mitzrayim, there, although it's inui d'tzibur, but it's inui b'dei adam, so that it makes more sense. If we had to write this on a flowchart, if it makes more sense to set up an analogy between the inui of Kippur and the inui of Man, because in both those cases the inui is b'dei shamayim. That's less attractive, less comfortable of a position than comparing the inui of Yom Kippur to the inui of Mitzrayim, because the inui of Mitzrayim is human inui. It is the affliction and the suffering that is hoisted upon a person by another human being, by the Rishayim, the evildoers of Mitzrayim. And the inui of Yaakov Avinu, according to the accusation of Lavan, it's also bidei adam. And therefore, we take those two inuis, that of Mitzrayim and that of Yaakov, and we put those into a package called inui diyachid. Or forget about yachid. Better word, inui bidei adam. And on the other side of the scorecard, we're going to put the inui of Yom Kippur with the inui of Man, both of which are inui bidei shamayim. But inui bidei adam, that's going to apply either to Yaakov Avinu, again, according to this false accusation of Lavan, or to the terrible affliction of the Mitzrayim on the Jewish people, where the Torah says, Vayaris on Yenu, Su Precious Derech Eretz. Now, at this point, we begin a very long Agadata, but I think instead of beginning the Agadata, and maybe we might decide to skip the Agadata, I don't know, we'll have to negotiate that. I would like to share with you, let me see if I can find my page. Yeah. Okay. Okay. First, I want to get back to the question of the Havamina that Vinisamis Nafshosechem applies exclusively to Pigul and Nosar. And what does Yom Kippur add to Pigul and Nosar? Pigul and Nosar generate, if you eat them, a Chiv Karis, and Yom Kippur doesn't seem to add anything. We have a principle called Ein Iser Chal Al Iser. So yesterday we mentioned the Siach Yitzchak. He says that Yom Kippur would add the following. Let's say he ate a kizayis of Pigul and Nosar. He's not yet chayiv kares for Yom Kippur. He's chayiv kares for Pigul and Nosar until he eats kikoseves hagas. So when he eats that increment, if you remember, that's when he violates Yom Kippur. Now we have the Hagos Marsham. Again, the names are not so important to us, but he says, based on a Tosin Chulin, that when you have two Isurim that by definition have to overlap, which is called the Efshar Be'inyan Acher, then the principle is Isur Chalal Isur. And since there's no way that the Isur of Achilu of Yom Kippur could be Chal without the Isur of Pigul and Notzar, that's Efshar Be'inyan Acher, and therefore we apply the principle of Yesh Isur Chalal Isur. Then the Chuvas Yehuda Yala says that on Yom Kippur, you're also even in what's called an Achila Shalo Kedarka, Shalo Kedarchana Asa. If you do a strange kind of Achila, but you enjoy it, you violate Yom Kippur. But in Nosar and Pigul, we need what's called an Achila Kedarchana Asa, the normal kind of Achila. So what we're left with here, according to this tshuva, is what we call an Isur Mosif, which means that Yom Kippur is adding and expanding the scope of the Isur Pigul and Nosar to include even in the case of Shalo Keder Chana Asa. And finally, what happens if the Basar became Pigul on Yom Kippur? Let's say during one of the Avodos, there was a mess up and there was Pigul. So then once again, we don't apply the principle of Ein Isur Chal Isur. Ein Isur Chal Isur means you already have one Isur, and then in time T2, you're going to add another Isur. That you can't do. But if both Isurim emerge simultaneously, came Pigul on Yom Kippur, then Yesh Isur Chal Isur. Now, our Gemara raises the question of Tevel. Even if we have Vinisamis Nafshel Seichem for Pigul and Nosar, which generate a Chiyuv Kares, we don't know that the Torah enjoins us from Tevel, which is a Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim. This sugya proves, apparently without a shadow of a doubt, that Kares is more severe than Misa B'dei Shamayim. So we're going down a level when we go from Pigul and Nosar, which is Kares, to Tevel, which is only a Chiyuv Misa B'dei Shamayim. And there's a lot of literature on this because there seems to be a Rambam in Hilchos Bias Mikdash Perek Talmud that assumes that in certain situations, that's how the Kesef Mishnah interprets the Rambam, it could be that Misa B'dei Shamayim is more chamur than Kares. Now, if you list all the times that the Torah says, Inu, you come to the conclusion there are 5. In our Gemara, actually, if you count all the different Isurim as we expand them going down the line, it's actually 6. So it only says Inui 5 times, but now we have 6 on the list. We have Pigul and Notza number 1, Tevel number 2, Nevela number 3, Chulin number 4, Truma number 5, and Kachim is number 6. How do we derive 6 categories of Isur from 5 Inus? On this, we have a Tosas or Rosh. And he says that the Gemara could have asked that question. The Haisa Gemara Yichol Lahakshos Shein Kan Elahei Inuyim Veich Marvim Shisha Dvarim El Shebelav Hafi Parach LeShapir Umasik Demi Mikra Achrina Yolefle. In other words, since at the end of the day the Gemara is going to derive Achila and Shasiya from Havadati as a nefesh, Dover she Ma'abed as a nefesh, if a person doesn't eat or drink. So at the end of the day, the Gemara didn't even have to bother asking a question and objecting to the fact that you're deriving it from the repetition of Inui and there are only 5 and we need 6. The Gemara dropped the ball on that because at the end of the day, we don't accept that entire drasha. We're not going to base it on the Isra Achila and Shasi on Yom Kippur, derive it from the multiple times that the Torah repeats Inu. We're going to derive it from Vavadati as HaNefesh. And that means Inu Sheyekbo Avedas Nefesh. And that, the Gemara says, should be identified as Achila and Shasi. Okay, then, so that's where we're going to stop for now. And Emir Hashem pick this up tomorrow. So let me wish you a great day.